Hello, and you are listening to EcoJustice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. EcoJustice Radio acknowledges that we recorded this show on the traditional territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people and all of their relatives in the place we call Los Angeles. Welcome, I'm Jack Ide. On today's show, the environmental toll from the war in Ukraine. We feature a conversation between Darya Tsymbalyuk from the University of Chicago and Ursula K. Heise from UCLA, discussing Tsymbalyuk's recent book, Ecocide in Ukraine, sharing poignant accounts of witnessing ecocide in her homeland. Darya Tsymbalyuk is an interdisciplinary scholar, and her practice includes writing and image making. Most of Darya's work lies at the intersection of environmental humanities and artistic research. She's a recipient of the Mary Zirin Prize from the Association of Women in Slavic Studies in 2023 and the author of multiple articles in environmental humanities. Her book, Ecocide in Ukraine, The Environmental Cost of Russia's War, from Polity Press, was published in 2025. Ursula K. Heise holds the Marcia K. Howard Term Chair in Literary Studies at the Department of English and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She is a co-founder and current director of the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies. Her book includes, among others, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, Oxford University Press, 2008, and Imagining Extinction, The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, University of Chicago Press, 2016. On the show today, we're featuring a discussion on impacts of war on the countryside of Ukraine. The costs include widespread pollution from wrecked factories and military bombings, destruction of rare steppe and island ecosystems in the south, massive fires disrupted agricultural production, and significant damage to soil, air, and water quality. Some of the most intense fighting has been in the forests along the Donets River in the east. The war has severely impacted nuclear facilities, with both the Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia plants experiencing military actions that raise safety concerns. The conflict has led to operational challenges, including power shortages and increased risks of accidents, prompting international monitoring and calls for, restraint, please, to prevent nuclear incidents. The war has led to significant damage to dams, notably the Kakhovka Dam in the south, which was destroyed in June 2023, causing extensive flooding and environmental harm. This destruction has disrupted local ecosystems, contaminated water supplies, and affected agricultural production, with long-term consequences for both the environment and food security in the region. Moreover, I should add, we're not covering here who is responsible for this destruction and how that war might end, which is certainly being discussed in the media right now without really a proper solution. Of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, yet the harsh reality that many in the U.S. do not want to admit, the role our recent governments, Obama, Biden, and Trump, have played in pushing for Ukraine, NATO membership, funding a coup d'etat in 2014 against a democratically elected government, despite what you might think about them, along with other Western states blowing up the Minsk Accords, essentially twice, which could have managed the eastern regions of Ukraine while keeping them peacefully together as one country. And of course, avoiding all those people, just hundreds of thousands, maybe, I don't even know the number. It's so unbelievable how many people have been killed because of this war. While it's important to support Ukraine as an independent republic, it is a new creation with many competing histories and allegiances. Of course, Russia has committed atrocities, but so has Ukraine, and those did not begin in 2022. And finally, there's the Ukrainian government. Every time their politicians tell you Ukrainians will fight until victory and Western elites justify ramping up arms production while slashing social programs, with the same mantra. Keep in mind, there's been multiple polls have come out in Ukraine, conducted early July 2025. Almost 70% of Ukrainians say they favor a negotiated end to the war as soon as possible, compared with 24% who support continuing the fight until the supposed and very elusive victory. This marks a complete reversal from public opinion in 2022, when 73% favored Ukraine fighting until victory and 22% preferred that Ukraine seek a negotiated end as soon as possible. Now, what that negotiation would entail is really, that's a bigger question that we're going to even wander into, and certainly the Trump administration has no concept of what that would be, and the Biden administration had no interest in that negotiation. So we continue with this recording from the Thomas Mann House in Pacific Palisades, California, just down Sunset Boulevard from the mass destruction of that village and its hillside in 2025.
Thank you so much, the Thomas Mann House, for having me. It's really an immense honor. Despite the palm trees, there's the still presence for me of the memory of the war, and of course now also the scars of the fires. So it's been a lot kind of thinking and experiencing it here. So without further ado, I just share a couple of reflections that are coming from the book. And the picture on the cover of the event is a photo taken by my dad in the east of Ukraine, in Donetsk Oblast, close to the front lines. As you can see, it's a burned forest. In Ukraine, it would mean that there are mines and unexploded ordnance, so prevents you from going it. That's right, or signals you. So, but it's great that you find out even out this. Anyway, so this is the book. It was written very urgently. It took me 9 months to write it because you want to get the message out. So it's kind of in many ways an imperfect book that's meant to make an intervention and to keep the conversation going, to open up a conversation about the environment. And it's very personal in many ways. I wanted to write about Ukraine as a place of home, not only a place that you hear in the news in that context. Anyway, I'm going to just give you a little bit of a couple of frames through which I've been thinking, and one of them that I think one of the central things for me is the change of meanings, and how with the environmental destruction, our meanings of places, of things familiar, really dramatically shift. And in this sense, I kind of will argue that everybody is displaced to a certain degree because the things around you are destroyed or contaminated. And I came to work with this and on a book actually from this mini essay I wrote for IWM Post, which is an academic magazine based in Vienna. And I thought nobody would ever read it, but I guess editors had policy about it. It was kind of unexpected. But the essay is strangely on mushroom picking. Do people pick mushrooms here before? Is the thing? Yeah. Yes. Amazing. And Ukraine is like, it's a commitment in Ukraine to go mushroom picking. Right? Like it's so, people are very, very serious about it. And you get trained from kind of early age, your family introduces you. And it's, of course, for many people, it's a hobby, but it's also a way of making livelihood. And as you know from the picture of the forests are mined, they're lethal. And I remember when I was in Kyiv in 2022, I just overheard people at the hairdresser talking about mushroom picking, but they were not talking about what they found in the forest, which is usually people are bragging, how many mushrooms they collected. But they were talking about their neighbors who stepped on the landmine and got injured. And for me, that's a signal of how the landscapes and environments that are very familiar every day suddenly, carry lethal danger. And for me, this is one of the biggest changes with the war, is how your perception of space dramatically changes, and everything is dangerous, really. And if you look at the sky, this is where the missiles are coming from, right? It's not only where the stars are. And so I wrote a small piece about mushroom picking and mushrooms, and then it grew into the Ecological project. But this shift in meanings is what I'm really interested in as a person in the humanities, and not a person who actually collects data on the ground. And one other example I just wanted to share of how the landscape changes meanings are these man-made environments, which are called shelter belts. You have them here, no? I don't know if you have them in California. Do people recognize them? This kind of plantations, I don't know. They're everywhere across Ukraine. They also exist in the United States and many other countries, but basically It's these are rows of trees that are planted near the agricultural fields to prevent wind, to prevent erosion, and they also kind of increase biodiversity. And they're really kind of phenomenal in a lot of grassland area. They became phenomenal, biodiversity hotspot. In my region, for example, in the north, I'm from the south of Ukraine, so in the north of my oblast, there was research done that one of these shelter belts hosts 57 species of birds, many of them hunting birds, because they don't nest on the ground, they need to nest in the trees, and the rest is basically prairie around and monocultural benefits. So, I mean, it is a kind of like mirror in itself. But, yeah, so you have this, the shelter belts, which were in Ukraine largely planted in the 50s and 70s, though the history of them is much longer, but on a mass scale, during Stalin's great transformation of nature plan. I didn't really want to put Stalin there, but here you go. But yeah, he's kind of looking at the map of where, I mean, the really big ones in the south of Russia, but this is the whole map of where they were planted, and this is Ukraine, and you can see they're all over Ukraine, kind of marking the fields. And if you're talking about, this is kind of where Ukraine is, and if you're talking about the south and east, and these are the territories where the front line really runs through, and currently also the north is Okinawa and Sumy. But this part is predominantly prairie, steppe regions, which are marked by this, by the shelter belts, which are quite often the only kind of wooded, forested areas. And as I said, they were, they've been, so they were planted in the Soviet Union, they became this unexpectedly kind of biodiversity spots, and they were abandoned with the fall of the Soviet Union because they were not maintained. But the environmentalists kind of had been fighting for them to actually be recognized as environmentally important areas and reframed as spaces of life because they host so much life in the prairie regions. This is some more historical photos, but with the war, this idea of them hosting life and sheltering gained new meaning, and I'll just show you one of the clips from the front line. And as I said, remember that we're talking about this flat, prairie-like landscapes. There are nowhere to hide. And the only places that people hide, soldiers hide, are in the shelter belts, right? And usually the images you see from the front line are just completely obliterated. Shelter belts, and they became really as iconic as the images of bombed houses. And in many ways, they're also this, walls that are completely destroyed, just like the houses. And the classic example, I don't know if anybody's seen 20 Days in Mariupol, the film. It's free on PBS. But Mstislav Chernov and won the Oscar. It's, I mean, if you want to break your heart, I really recommend to watch it. I think it's the best film about the war. And this is the new film by Mstislav Chernov, 2,000 meters to Avdiivka, which follows an assault brigade going to storm a village, which doesn't exist actually, just a geographical spot. But what for me is very interesting, the whole film, the whole documentary is set in a shelter belt. So everything here is mined, and they go through this narrow strip of woods. And in many ways, it's a documentary about the shelter belt, but also what shelter belt means. It means now both destruction, but also the only place where people are sheltered when on the front line. So the meanings change. I'll just read this quote by an environmentalist on the front line. Everything human that exists in the war huddles to the shelter belt. They are home, a shelter, their rest, safety, and hope. Never before was the life of humans integrated so closely with the kilometers of linear planters. The other aspect that really I wanted to highlight is the question of labor. And I think we hear about environmental destruction in Ukraine, we hear about ecocide through legal framework. But for me, it's really the labor of people on the ground, environmentalists and other people who document it and who write about it. And the material reality of the war is something that's important for me to speak about. And one of the stories I'll give as an example is documented in this book by Ivan Rusev, an environmental researcher from the Tuzla Lagoons, this nature park all down south, completely south of North in Ukraine on the Black Sea. It used to be one of the few places that had direct access to the Black Sea because all the other spots are militarized. And even then, you wouldn't be able to actually reach the Black Sea because of the military control. He wrote this book about cetaceans. There's 3 cetaceans in Ukraine, all 3 endangered. Common dolphin, common bottlenose dolphin, and harbor, I can't pronounce it, porpoise? Porpoise. I can't pronounce it. But, and then I also interviewed him. I went and I interviewed him, and he told me, he's been documenting the the deaths of the cetaceans, and between 28th of March 2022 and 31st of January 2023, so really just kind of less than a year, they counted 52 bodies of cetaceans in the nature park, which is a really dramatic increase from what used to be in previous years. The scientists are still debating what are the reasons for the deaths. So, the woman rush kind of equating it immediately to the war, and we can talk about it. But the most incredible thing that he has in the book, and he told me in an interview, is the story of how this process of documentation occurs. And here I'll just show you also a photo by Jana Kononova, who did this photo series for Birds and Fly, documenting the autopsies of the dolphins, and then just the photos themselves. And I'll just leave this one. So the way it happens is that they get a call from a border guard, because remember, Black Sea borders, and it's 30 kilometers, which is about 25 miles away from the nature park. The border guard discovered the body of a dolphin. At that moment in the nature park, well, they had a couple of cars, but lots of cars were donated to the front. And also we are talking about extended areas where not all cars go. So they have to go and get the body from the place it was discovered and bring it. And what they do, they get a donkey called Yasha, they get a wagon and 2 employees of the nature park. And it's August in Ukraine, which is like August in Chicago. It's like hot. It's very, very hot. Like you don't want to be outside. And you can imagine, so 30 kilometers is not very close. You can imagine going with the donkey in this very hot day to this place where the body is recovered. I mean, and then the road is obviously practically unexistent. Anyway, at some point, the donkey refuses to walk further. So these 2 guys walk to the dolphin's body and then drag the dolphin's body through the water until they can reach closer to where the wagon and the donkey are. Put it on a donkey, return to the nature park. In Ukraine, you don't have freezers in a nature park. It's expensive. A nature park can't afford having a freezer to do autopsies of dolphins. So what they did, they negotiated with the local fishermen, commercial fishermen, that they would store the body. So the guys then, with the body, go to the village, they bring this dolphin, deposit it in a refrigerator, and then because it's Ukraine, what happens, there's an attack on infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And so the electricity goes off, the body starts to stink. I mean, it was already stinking by the time it was picked up because it was, time passed. It stinks in the fridge, and the fisherman says, it's going to contaminate all my produce, and he throws it away. He throws it to the landfill, and he informs the nature park saying, sorry, I threw away the body. Calls the park. The park was like, okay, but we need the body for evidence. We need it for documentation because Ukraine is actually collecting the case on Ecocide, and the prosecutor and the team coming from Kyiv. So we need to do something. Kyiv is really far away. It's more than a 9-hour train and further. And so they get together with the donkey and the wagon. They go to the landfill. They spend hours digging through the landfill, which you can imagine the smell. It's summer. Everything is rotten. They find the dolphin, which is also already like half eaten by dogs, the stray dogs. They recover it, and they still need to store it because the team is coming from Kyiv. And they go back to the lagoon. They find the saltiest place. They attach the body and they wait for somebody to come from the capital. And it's usually Pavel Golden, he's here with the back, who does autopsies. He does the autopsy, and then the data goes to Germany and Italy. And the case continues. But this material labor of like how this process actually goes is what's important. And the very last thing I would say is the question of inhabiting the space, of what does it actually mean, which I've been thinking a lot about here, also going to the ocean and thinking whether to swim or not to swim, after the fires. But thinking of this picture from my hometown, from the beach I go to all the time, and probably, I'm going in 2 weeks, so I'm going to go there again. Picture documents the mining engineer pulling out leftovers of cluster munition from the water. And then you have the woman going for a swim on the background. And she clearly didn't want to be in a picture. Other pictures don't picture her, so it's not staged. Like she's kind of trying to do her thing, enjoy the summer. And then you have these guys working and pulling out cluster munition. And the question I have, in general, in many ways, is like, how do you narrate the war? And how do you address this kind of experience? What is it how do we actually talk about this coexistence, and what motivates this woman to swim? Is it, I don't know, I'll leave it probably open as a question. But that's one of the challenges I had of how not to how to actually embrace this complexity of living there. Anyway, and I'll stop probably here.
You're listening to EcoJustice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially and environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org and socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at Patreon/EcoJustice Radio. Today you're listening to The Environmental Toll from the War in Ukraine. I'm your host, Jack Iden. We feature a conversation between Darya Tsymbalyuk from the University of Chicago and Ursula K. Heise from UCLA, discussing Tsymbalyuk's recent book, Ecocide in Ukraine, sharing poignant accounts of witnessing ecocide in her homeland.
Yeah, thank you so much, Darya. And first of all, congratulations on the book. And so I wanted to start with a few questions that I think will allow all of us maybe to hear a little bit more about how you understand the context of writing the book and how you position it. So my first question was about, okay, so this is a book about the environmental impact of the Russian invasion, rather than just the destruction of cities, the costs in lives and so forth that is amply documented in the news. But the war isn't over, and we don't know when it will be at this point, I think. And so the question is, how can we actually talk about the environmental impact? Well, in other words, what prompted you to write and publish this book now, rather than waiting and seeing what the impact finally is going to be?
Yeah, thank you. I think, as I said, it's a very imperfect book, which I'm very fully aware for many reasons. First of all, data is scarce still, so even if you wanted to do full analysis, you cannot, even of things that happened in the past. But for me, it's more important to make those interventions and keep the conversation going, so people talk and actually,
which conversation precisely?
Both about Ukraine, I think, and about kind of the scale of destruction. And there is something about the environment to me, and that's why if I talk about it as the loss of the world, that there's a kind of different almost magnitude and grief to me when we think on the environmental level. Not to compare. I mean, I don't think it's any kind of comparison of losses. That would always be a false strategy. But there's something that you think in terms of different temporalities when it comes to environment, how long the contamination lasts, how deeply things are terraformed and changed. That just overwhelming. Actually, I feel very overwhelmed when I start thinking of the dramatic impact that there is. But also, I came a long time ago this topic through displacement and in a war context, and people who were displaced from the war regions after 2014, after the start of the war, because the war has been going on now, which seems so forever. And they talked about environment. I was not interested at all, but it mattered to them what kind of places they left behind, the strangers of places that they moved to. They couldn't read the landscape, right? Mm-hmm. They would go into I had somebody who worked outdoors, and he kept walking into stinny nettle, and the coworkers were like, "What's wrong with you? Why are you going to the stinny nettle?" And say, "But I don't recognize it," right? So there's the landscape you need to know how to read, mm-hmm. And so it's the attention of the people who were displaced to this importance also that kind of led me to it. But also people in Ukraine really talk a lot about environment. And then one of the trips I was returning to Ukraine, and I don't go around, hi, my name is Darya, I'm working on environmental destruction. I was on the train, and the woman on the train just kept talking about this particular species that got impacted by the breach of the Kakhovka Dam, and whose habitats were destroyed. And there's a very particular blind rat mole. It's a little kind of, lives underground. Nobody has ever seen it, probably. Very few people even managed to document it on iNaturalist, so it's a very rare species. But she kept talking about this animal being endangered by the war, and she wasn't an environmentalist. It was kind of a recognition of the shared, I think, space of disappearance, of the catastrophe. And so I was listening then, and I was like, wow, it's really becomes public conversation in Ukraine.
And so what was your process for gathering information? I mean, part of it seemed to be your own travels, and where you actually talked to residents or to soldiers or to people that participated in this. Some of it seemed to be drawing on unpublished sources. So what was your process for gathering what data there are about the environmental impact at this point.
Yeah, and the number of things published, the thing is that happens, and the book is, I think, 90% Ukrainian sources, which was a very intentionally done so, and, environmentalists on the ground, and I always say, their work, first of all, they're all, in danger. People are working in danger no matter where you're in Ukraine. Many of them are mobilized. Many of them already were killed. It's the conditions of life. Also the kind of the material environment in which they worked is extremely precarious, and they keep producing research, and they keep, researching the books around, as well as investigative journalists. I was saying journalists are probably also the biggest producers of knowledge on Ukraine at the moment. So I really wanted, so I read a lot of sources, and what's said to me, there's a fantastic platform in Ukraine, UWUX, Ukraine War Environment. Ask me, I'll follow up with that. But they publish in English the most incredible analysis of environmental destruction, and they never get quoted in Washington Post and New York Times. The media never goes to them, even though they created this website to actually present it. They don't have visibility. And so part of me is actually kind of trying to find a way to pull these voices who are doing the actual groundwork, and somehow they don't get visibility, So that's part of, so a lot of their sources and the research that they do, interviewing them. But also, when I went to Ukraine, it's not field work, it's going home, right? And I commit just being around and talking to people and just experiencing it as part of my world as well. And I wanted to preserve that sense, which is different than you're going somewhere that you have a different relationship to.
But doesn't that make it also harder to know what the overall impact really is? Because you don't have sort of a panoramic overview at this point, but you just have sort of bits and pieces. That's sort of what interested me about the project, that on one hand, it's clear that the impact is absolutely massive. It is very hard to know just how massive it is, or which.
True, and it's ambiguous at points. As we know, the environment.
Well, we'll get to that. I'm eager to talk about that a little bit more later on.
Definitely. I think if you think of impact quantitative way, of course you don't know any company at the moment. Though Ukraine does make a hunt from it is very lost. But I think it's an emotional impact that matters to me, or the impact of that kind of devastation of literally the world collapsing. It's the end of the world to Ukrainians. And by that I mean, of course it's, a loss of a dear person is also an end of the world, but it's also everything around.
Yeah, it's not like that. It's different. Yeah. It's different. Yeah, so that gets me to something else that relates to, I think, how you gather the bits and pieces that go into this book. And that was that when I read it, and maybe this is just me sort of being a literary scholar, but so at times it read to me like memoir, where you think about Mykolaiv, the place where you grew up, and you recount memories from what things looked like during your childhood and then what they look like now when you travel back. At other moments, it seemed like nature writing, or you delve into details of what particular landscapes look like, what they feel like, what their emotional impact is. Just what you were saying, and also how people feel about losing a particular landscape. Those are all things that sort of in the Anglo context would be part of nature writing. And then other parts of it do seem like war reporting. The dolphin story, which was one that we talked about when we met a week or so ago, that was a story that really stood out to me as well, as sort of heroic effort under these military, completely adverse conditions. There's a war journalism, war reporting. So how did you think about your writing and about the language that you use and about which scenes to choose and put together in particular chapters?
I realized the hardest question to ask, what genre is it? And I still don't know. I'm thinking.
I think it's clearly a mix, but I just wonder how you think about that particular mix.
I think probably very intuitively, and a big part of it, I think to write this honestly, I couldn't, there's no way I could write it from, and I don't believe that objectivity exists in a pure sense, right? So, and I couldn't even pretend to be there. I think it was really honest of me to guide the reader what it means for me, even distantly, witnessing this. And what it means for, millions of people who are from Ukraine or have a close relation to Ukraine, whether scholars or, people who worked in Ukraine. I mean, it hits you differently, and the emotional overwhelm is so intense. And I mean, there are days I struggle to work. I mean, I get in working, but I'm kind of like split, like a double worlds existing, right? I get numb, and I get nauseous as well when intense attacks happened. And I think that was like making it visible of what's, guiding through that relationship, and making it a home. I think also Ukraine becomes so abstracted now, like any other place in the world which is under attack, to becoming a war zone and, being in the news. And then I really wanted to also tell about it, a place which is a home, and a place which is loved, and a place that is extremely alive. And that's something we talked when we first met, right? That in Ukraine you really kind of feel this intensity of life, like nowhere else. And I mean, or like in other places which undergoes, unfortunate disasters. Yeah, exactly. I mean, in my case, because I'm from there. So I really wanted to preserve that, and I think that comes a lot through memoir or autobiographic writing, and thinking through these cultural meanings, and even, like the cover features storks, right? And they have really heavy, but in like the burning landscape. Yeah. In my home region, actually. I mean, it's a kind of a coincidence. But they are so linked with this cultural meaning. When people see these birds, there's very intense response to that, right? Because they always return to the same place. They symbolize home, they symbolize spring. Yeah.
But so for your audiences in Western Europe, here in North America, so why should you worry about the environmental impact at this point, when day after day you turn on the news and you hear about, hundreds more people killed, hundreds more apartment buildings bombed to smithereens, infrastructure destroyed. You talk about infrastructure in your energy chapter at the end, which I really appreciate. But so I instinctively related to this because I'm interested in, the rights of other species and how we position humans in relation to other species. But that's not a widely shared approach. So what's the sort of argument that you make, or that you would want to make, for why people need to pay attention to this at this point, when the war is still going on and people are being killed and their property is being destroyed every day?
I mean, I think there are two reasons. I mean, first of all, it matters to people there, and they talk about trends, and they talk about ecocide. There is public discussion about they clearly go lens to like collect data and evidence, and there is one moment I write about, and I should have brought these videos around, and it's just heartbreaking. But there are these two horses that stayed in Avdiivka, in the city in the east, which is now occupied and fully destroyed. But already then it was like fully destroyed. And the one of the horse farms was attacked and bombed. Most horses were evacuated, but two broke loose and were running around this, Soviet block apartment city, which is bombed out. It's completely apocalyptic imagery, the Soviet block apartments, and the horses just running around looking for food. And the local police tried to evacuate them. They got people from all the way from Kharkiv, which is quite far, come and try to get the horses out. And when they came, the truck was targeted with a drone and burned down, which is very expensive as well for a small NGO to actually own a horse truck. They returned to Kharkiv. They figured out that horses are social beings, so they brought a horse from Kharkiv to the front line, came this horse to the city, where one of the men was riding this horse. The two loose horses saw the newcomer horse and followed, and they were evacuated. But it was like police, NGO, like so many people involved. So clearly it matters for people and not only for profit. I mean, I don't want to idealize relations with animals. There's, always very critical how that portrayed and used by propaganda. Sentimentalized. But there are also stories in which people, it's clearly not cost and benefit kind of relationship, but there's something else that moves them to go at lengths to get the animals out. But so one of the things that matters to people. But of course, one thing we know that environmentally we are so connected, and I mean, environments don't respect national borders. Right? It doesn't exist. And actually, the story I like to give is by Kate Brown, who's a historian at MIT, and she has this incredible book, Manual for Survival. on Chernobyl, and it's just a brilliant read. I totally recommend. To read everything by Kate Brown. But she ends the book with the story of a truck of blueberries that. So blueberries are collected a lot in the region of Chernobyl, and sometimes for export. They are monitored in Ukraine, but because you can mix them in different quantities, you can get out the radioactive Chernobyl blueberries. Anyway, and she traces.
They're still radioactive now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And mushrooms. Totally. But she follows this truck in US, which is stopped at the Canadian border because it was, radioactivity was there and was detected. And at first, at the border, they were like, what is that? And then we discovered there were lots of blueberries, but these are frozen blueberries coming all the way from Ukraine, and you would think something is so far away across the ocean. I mean, it's the world is much more connected than you'd like to think, I think.
Yeah, Chernobyl was interesting. So I was in Belarus twice, in 2001 and 2002, to teach like week-long or 2-week-long seminars at a university that Lukashenko then proceeded to shut down. Not because of me, but because too many people from too many Western professors coming in. And one evening when I was out with the students, they actually had a very intense discussion about mushrooming. And some of them said, oh, it's so rich. And this was 2001, 2002, mind you, more than 20 years ago. And at the time, they were discussing whether, where some of them thought this was completely crazy and this was absolutely radioactive and nobody should go mushroom gathering anywhere near the Ukrainian border or, get anywhere close, let alone eat those mushrooms. Whereas others said, no, this is long ago. These mushrooms are absolutely fine. So even at the time, there were very, very divided opinions about this. So, and the Chernobyl example is an interesting sort of different case of the environmental disaster that we may have time or not to come back to. But so in connection with the different side of writing that you were talking about, so how do you balance, on one hand, the sort of obligation that a journalist or documentarian has to present all the facts that are there that are relevant to the story that you want to tell, not to leave anything out, not to falsify any information, and to be, as comprehensive as possible, and obviously in seeking sources, with what must have been sort of an intense emotional investment in what was going on. So how do you balance that? And I mean, not just in the research, but then also in the writing, given that you write for people who will have varying degrees of emotional attachment to the places that you write about. How did you negotiate that in writing? I don't know. I mean, you said you get nauseous when you hear about, new attacks and things like that. And I imagine that visiting some of these places and seeing the damage would have been equally impactful and from emotion. So how did you manage that, or how did you handle that when you then try to translate that into the writing?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's like what I think by trying to pursue is it's try to write it honestly, not to over sentimentalize it, not to make it over spectacular, but also not to go on the other side and think I'm gonna make it very objective, which I wouldn't be able to anyway. So it's kind of, it is a balance, and it's kind of, I don't know, it takes a lot of, it is listening to that kind of inner honesty of like what actually it would mean to tell the story, and always also thinking of a variety of people to whom I'm telling. So while I'm telling to a Western reader, of course, writing in English, I'm also thinking, am I able to tell it in an honest way that the people with whom I'm in conversation on the ground in Ukraine would say, okay, this is, it makes sense, So it's kind of also thinking about those on the ground.
How relate to different types of audiences?
And the different ways of understanding this kind of thing.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests, listen to extended episodes, and get connected with us on social media. Today you're listening to The Environmental Toll from the War in Ukraine. I'm your host, Jack Iden. We feature a conversation between Darya Tsymbalyuk from the University of Chicago and Ursula K. Heise from UCLA discussing Tsymbalyuk's recent book, Ecocide in Ukraine, sharing poignant accounts of witnessing ecocide in her homeland.
So were there models for you for that? I mean, there's a ton of literature, of course, now, both fictional and non-fictional, both in film, on the web, in print, about environmental damage and about, the different types of environmental violence that occur. I mean, Dubrow Nixon, he's a scholar he's an Africanist and a scholar of post-colonial literature, coined the term slow violence more than 10 years ago for the gradual types of damage, but that can end up being just as destructive as a direct violence over the long term that occur in a lot of the global south versus the fast violence that occurs during times of disaster or times of war and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of storytelling about these kind of situations. Were there particular books or writers or filmmakers that inspired your writing here, or that sort of were a type of model for what you're trying to do in the clip?
Yeah, so other people working on war ecologists for sure, and I would say it's not only writing, but they really inspired me to, in a sad way, they provide a kind of guidance for me to understand what will happen to the environments in Ukraine. So you read them as academic literature, but you also read them as a kind of manual of possibilities where you can go. So Munira Khayyat's work on southern Lebanon, which has been in a state of war for much longer than Ukraine, in recent years, and recently, of course, again, excavated. And, she writes fascinatingly about people feeding goats, because goats don't cause their minds hollow up, unlike cows,
Right.
And you kind of think like, oh, this is the future of Ukraine. This is how people make livelihood, they switch to other ways of husbandry and kind of ways of her work. Again, a scheme on DMZ in Korea, which is an even more further distant future, and also very situated versus Chernobyl and what happens there and the narratives of Chernobyl.
Just curious, because I did some work with Vietnamese colleagues. Any Vietnamese samples there from what they call the American War and we call the Vietnam War?
I have to go much deeper into the actual. I mean, of course, the work on ecocide and the emergence of ecocide.
Yeah.
But environmentally, the person I've been in conversation with is Kuchika Guha, who's American Finnish, and we know each other and intersected on questions of colonialism in many ways, but she worked in phenomenology also.
Yeah.
Place, but I would take recommendations on Vietnam because Vietnam is
that was a super interesting learning experience to me in editing this anthology of essays about sort of the environmental narrative in Vietnam, because Americans always think first about Agent Orange when Vietnam comes up. It is always sort of the Vietnam War that first appears. For Vietnamese scholars and also for a lot of the government at the time, that it was just part of a much longer period of, on one hand, various types of colonialism, French colonialism that had already devastated forests, changed water management, and become Delta and things like that are not so present to our image of what's happening with environmental crisis in Vietnam. And then also, quite violent confrontations and oppressions on the part of the Kin majority vis-a-vis ethnic minority, which is also a story that repeats itself all over the world, that particular ways of stewarding nature are suppressed or are discouraged or are violently displaced by majority management. So the way in which environmental management, comes also with certain claims to power and the ability to displace certain populations and things like that. So I think this is sort of a really interesting area, the way in which certain types of environmental disasters are in the foreground and others that sometimes are more gradual, but sometimes are not, but are just not visible to a certain audience, especially, I think American media are, like all media, are very selective about which kinds of crises that cover. And, I think the environmental impact of the Russian invasion has somewhat covered, but not a whole lot. So you were talking earlier, we were talking a little bit about sort of the non-human perspective on all this. And I sort of sense that in various, it's obvious in the title image, in the dolphin and donkey Ecocide. But then you also you focus in without sort of going all the way down the line in the way that some writers now do, that they actually focalize a whole story through the eyes of an animal, or even make an animal, or sometimes even a plant or a tree, the narrator of a story. I mean, in fiction, that's become sort of a really radical strategy for getting a completely different impression of what environmental crisis feels like and what it means to lose a world, right? To sort of allude to the shared of lost worlds, or loss of shared worlds. Sorry, that it gives this your book forms part of, and that your talk form part of. This is a very radical strategy. I don't think you go all the way there, but there are chapters where you do sort of foreground the role of cats, or that mind sniffing dog. Patron or Patron or was sort of announced now, yeah. So what was the intention that was going into those parts of the book, where it's not so much the meaning of plants or animals to the human victims of war, which you already talk about, but really the animal victims or the plant victims or yourselves.
Yeah. So first of all, I think my intention was in that kind of presenting Ukraine as a living space, a life space, and populated, of course, inhabited by not only humans but all kinds of species, right? And thinking of who are the agents in the stories, and the birch mouse is an agent, a bat is an agent. I think that was important for me to kind of.
So what do you mean by that when you say the birch mouse is an agent or a bat is an agent? I mean, I think that's sort of in academia they talk about this kind of stuff all the time, but it may not be obvious.
Quite literally, I mean, if people, not everybody, and I think there is also this perception that everybody can just leave the war zone, which is completely untrue, and it's also in many ways. But it's difficult to leave a war zone. So, but equally so for a lot of species, it is an absolute destruction of the habitat they have. Right, like this is the end. They don't. I mean, one of the species I write about is this particular type of cornflower that grows only 2 places near my hometown in the world. It has only like 2 this small fields that survived. I mean, it's because it's a prairie region, it's all agricultural monofields.
It's endemic to those 2 places.
It's endemic, it's completely endangered. It was, I mean, the kind of the sad irony that, of course, nobody cared about it until Russia attacked and suddenly it became important. But, it only exists in these 2 places, and in these places are gone, and one of them was also severe impact. I mean, both of them, but one of them. This is the species doesn't exist, right? It's extinction, as it's your work, so much. So really thinking of so they are impacted. So obviously, sometimes on levels which are different to us, but also and going back to also what impacts. I mean, I think reading on kind of cosmologies, the different relations to place, indigenous relations to place, which is very different in Ukraine, and I don't want to equate, but I do think that through my years of work in Ukraine, I use a kind of different understanding of modern human and relations, which is obviously like that hard divide between human and humanist in some Western cultures, and thinking of that, how to reflect that kind of aliveness, vitality of Ukrainian thinking of what it means to be human. Which encompasses quite often the vegetable patch. I mean, I know people who didn't leave the war zone because their tomatoes were not ripe. I mean, I know somebody who stayed.
Yes, you mentioned that.
Yeah. Or like staying because of orchids.
The plants chapter, I think.
Yeah. It's really intense, and it's not always seen as something outside. So there's me and there's my, vegetable patch. It's kind of an extension of the self. So in a way, it's a different relationship, I think. Yeah.
And that was also true in Chernobyl, right? I mean,
there
were old people who came back, even though it was still really, I mean, even in the first few months after the disaster, who just came back because they could not imagine living outside of their house, their garden. They wanted to take care of their garden and so forth. And Masami Yuki in Japan has written about something very similar, about the aftermath of Fukushima, that she writes about. She's an environmental humanist who is very interested in food. And so she was very interested in why people, both from the Fukushima zone, but then also in some other parts of Japan, would actually insist on eating food from there, even knowing that the government was telling them, no, this may not be safe right now. Don't breed this mouse. Don't eat these vegetables. It's not a good idea. and they did it anyway. And she was very interested in how people's identity and their sense of being at home was actually involved in that. And I saw that sort of replicated here in the incidents of where people were actually not so much attached to, and that was something that struck me, that in a lot of cases that you described in the book, it's not actually sort of anything that an American audience would perceive as sort of wild nature that people are attached to, but on the contrary, I mean, also the shelter belts, right, which are very human created, but even more so these vegetable gardens, the flower gardens, even the domestic plants that you write about. So the attachments are very intense to various kinds of non-human organisms that don't always sort of fit into North American notions of wild nature. Right?
No, that's true. And part of it, yeah, and it's very complex. I mean, the houseplant is anywhere you go in Ukraine, like hospital, bank, university, it doesn't matter. This room would be full of houseplants. It's, is really on the next level.
Note to the directors.
There's something there that I'm looking at, but I also sometimes wonder with the vegetable gardens and the batches, the summer houses, the allotments, whether it's also in a sense of in times of political instability, which is unfortunately very frequent in a place like Ukraine. And even like thinking, I grew up in the 90s. The 90s, it's the collapse of the Soviet Union. All infrastructures, it was. I grew up without like electricity, running water, all that stuff. People make laws, or professions didn't exist anymore. I mean, it was extremely dramatic. And I grew up in the periphery, like far from that. That was really
Southern Ukraine.
Southern Ukraine, forgotten. Nobody has ever even been there from Ukraine, cut off. Anyway, but there to survive is the vegetable patch. Right, people. This is the only stability. The no potatoes will be there tomorrow if they tend them. Hopefully, drought happens.
Okay, but that's material survival. That's one thing,
And then emotional, but they're connected.
Yeah, I think. Well, they can be connected, but what really struck me about the tomatoes are not key anybody's survival, right? And yet it seemed like some of the people that you were talking about, I'm not going to leave here until I can harvest my tomatoes, which is insane from a radical viewpoint, but in a sort of cultural and emotional logic, it does make sense.
Because it's a way of also understanding who you are. It's about practice of how you exist as a person is caring for your tomatoes, right? But I do think, and I don't want to make it like purely materialistic, but I do think because of this precarity and the material realities, I think to take into account into which conditions people live and how those infrastructures was developed. Not because sometimes, I didn't grow up, actually, my family never had a summer house, which I really felt that I was left out, like without a vegetable patch, and I still do. I really deep right here now. I'm very happy for this, but like I feel like it's like I'm missing out on it. Though when I talk to friends and like researching gardens, they would be like, "But Darya, I really didn't want to deep potatoes. I just wanted to bake piano. That was a disaster. My summer is always in a vegetable patch." So people always warn me of like romanticizing these practices because for a lot of people it was also just. Labor.
I have big debates about this with my eco friends here in LA, where some of us, some of my grandmother, my close colleague, she has like a lemon tree and she plants all the veggies in her backyard and sort of makes pretty serious arguments about how that has a minor but significant impact on the food chain and it leads the food chain. And so I'm like, I've never been able to harvest any more than like, a little basket of strawberries from any garden that I've ever been in touch with. So the garden that I now have, I'm more interested in let's have something for the hummingbirds and something for and I plant violet invasives like fennel because swallowtails love them and they hatch from them. I just had 2 swallowtails hatched this morning. So that was really clear. We're really cool because they're amazing caterpillars and then very strangely shaped cocoons. But so there are different philosophies about how you should use these private natural spaces, right? For the sake of other species or for the sake of food or whatever. Anyway, let's get a little bit more to some of the more positive sides of what you described. You said earlier that you thought the impact was ambiguous, the impact of the war. Would you talk a little bit more about that? It sounds like it's a disaster. How is it ambiguous?
I would say it's almost like not a Venn diagram, but it's like one side the other. So overall, it's obviously it's a massive disaster, right? And I don't want to diminish that. And I think like sometimes when some of the use presents in the unexpected emerging habitats. It also kind of like you cannot. I think the baseline, right, is that the incredible destruction that occurred. But within that, because environments very complex, and sometimes when you remove the human, it actually, has unexpected outcomes for the way species interact. So in that sense, some of the areas that are abandoned, they will have species returning there, or in my hometown, you would see pheasants in the park that were not there before. But I do find that I have seen reports which only kind of focus on the, positively framed, almost like kind of celebrate. It's similar to Chernobyl, right? People love the stories about Chernobyl fusion and how it's overrated, but you've briefly talked about it, but, the sadness of it, almost, how sad it is that animals prefer radiation over humans, and it is. And similarly, right, that, all the species would return to, this contaminated land, because, they're not disturbed by human being present. So in that sense, it is complex. At the same time, I would say, so media both tend to over-dramatize, and that's why I mentioned these dolphins, very quick conclusions, and ecosystems do have unexpected ways of recovery or unexpected ways to responding, and change. So it's always more complex than we read, I think. And when you should go to and talk to scientists, the picture is not as black and white as you would like to have it. I think that's one of the outcomes that I had. But it's all within this horrible context that we should.
I remember growing up in Germany in the state of Rheinland-Pfalz in the 1960s, and my parents were big mushroom gatherers, and we would go off many weekends. And at the time, it was completely unsurprising to me to see an old rusty tank in one of the field or forests where we were gathering mushrooms. Or we were kind of running around while parents were gathering the mushrooms, so they actually knew what they were doing. And we'd find sort of expired ordnance and sort of the leftovers of trenches or things like that. At the time, I was a kid, I didn't think about this, but this was in the 1960s, so 20 years after or more, after the end of the war. And you still sort of had that memory of the impacts of the war, so that will certainly be there. Do you think, you call this ecocide, and you mentioned death and sort of the mourning that comes with compromising these war landscapes. A lot of times in the book, do you see a possibility for resurrection, for restoration? What would that look like? Do you think about that?
I have to stay optimistic somehow in general, I think, otherwise it doesn't make sense to continue, right? And in my optimistic moment, I hope that this discussion we have, because of the loss, there's much more interest and attention to endangered species in Ukraine, I think, to the landscapes themselves, to the ecosystems. Suddenly people remember the species exist, or even that we should care for the steppes, not just plant corn there all the time. There's when I'm hopeful, I hope that maybe that shifts something in our perception of the spaces and make us care. When I talk to the environmentalists, it's worse, and in fact the war opens the door. It's actually, I should have brought that quote from Thomas Mann, but reading The Magic Mountain, there's a moment when
we talk about that.
Yeah. Hans Castorp's uncle comes to visit. And, Hans Castorp is talking about the stars, and the uncle continues like, well, this guy is definitely crazy. Why care about the stars, right? This is clearly the sign that something is not right in his head. And in many ways, that's how it deals with the environment. It was why? It's not our first priority. We need to survive. That we'll think later, right? But that also means and then the society is completely exhausted. And they have protests in Kyiv now again going on, so it's politically active. But of course, how many?
This is about the dismantling of the anti-corruption.
Yeah, it's getting rolled back apparently. Since but So the people are very politically engaged. But of course, how many battles can you fight? And the environment, people are still protesting in the environmental movements everywhere. But one of the things, and of course, this country is also involved, is that always the business lobby is very strong, and it's easier during the war to cut forests, to extract whatever we want to extract.
Oh, right. That could also be that under the cover of war, you can discharge Fancy foods and
Exactly. And the fecal aspects even, there's, the most, environment is really doing incredible work in Ukraine.
Hey, listeners, to check out the extended recording of this show or to explore our other shows, visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, and subscribe to our podcast. This has been EcoJustice Radio and our show, The Environmental Toll from the War in Ukraine. Thank you to Darya Tsymbalyuk and Ursula K. Heise. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe and share the episodes. You have been listening to EcoJustice Radio, a project of SoCal350. Executive producer, myself, Jack Eit. Co-host, Jessica Aldridge. Co-host, Carrie Kim. And engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.